My name is Keith Nugent. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research at La Trobe University, and on behalf of the university, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Bold Thinking Series panel discussion for 2018. There will be 2 other Bold Thinking events held in October and November here at the State Library Theaterette. Women's voices are raised louder than ever before, but are they being fully heard? Tonight's panel discussion asks whether feminism is at and where it is at, and we will consider what needs to happen to effect real change. Has feminism lost its way, or has it just evolved to reflect the changing times? If the inequalities of our mothers and grandmothers still exist today, how do we ensure a more equitable future for our daughters, indeed for everyone? Tonight's conversation will explore whether women can actively reshape our world rather than merely participate in it. It will also consider the rise of digital feminism and if hashtag activism has been enough to spark social change, or whether more action is needed to ensure gender equality today. On that note, La Trobe is actively engaged in this space with the Vice-Chancellor, Professor John Dewar, a male champion of change and a gender pay equality ambassador with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. In August this year, we launched our Diversity and Inclusion Plan, which included our Square the Ledger project, celebrating the lives of La Trobe women with the Victorian Women's Trust. Our SAGE, Science and Gender Equity, interim report, the 2018 to 2022 Gender Equality Blueprint, and we awarded 3 Tracy Benavenua-Marr Research Fellowships, which support academics who have major caring responsibilities and allows them to maintain their career momentum. The university sector desperately needs to see more women in leadership positions, and these fellowships were designed to ensure, or at least begin to rectify that deficit. So, without further ado, on tonight's esteemed panel, we have Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. So we'll start, well, we won't quite go in order, but we'll start with Vice-Chancellor's Fellow and Distinguished Professor Jenny Graves, over there. So please give a wave, Jenny. Whose research compares genomes of humans and Australian animals to explore how sex works and how it evolved. The work of her group led to the discovery of the SRY gene on the Y chromosome that makes babies male. She uses comparisons of distantly related mammals to explore the origin, function, and fate of human sex genes and chromosomes, infamously predicting the disappearance of the human Y chromosome, although I'm sure Jenny will tell us not for some time yet. Jenny has produced 4 books and more than 430 research articles on animal genomes and sex. She has received many awards and honours, including an Order of Australia in 2010 and the Prime Minister's Prize for Science in 2017. Indeed, Jenny was the first woman to win that prize solo, first woman to win it on her own. She's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, and she was on the executive as Foreign Secretary, then Education Secretary. She is 2006 L'Oreal UNESCO Laureate for Women in Science and advocates for women in science at the local, national and international level. So welcome, Jenny. Joining her is Dr Beatrice Alba. There's me. She is a research fellow in the School of Psychology and Public Health at La Trobe University. Her PhD in psychology examined individual differences in how people think about social status, and she has published peer-reviewed research in international journals on a range of topics, including personality, prejudice and discrimination, as well as mental health. Beatrice is a regular contributor to The Conversation, where she writes about feminism and evolutionary psychology. She is a passionate and outspoken feminist who firmly believes that any biological differences between women and men should not be a barrier to gender equality and social justice. So welcome, Beatrice. Our third panellist is Clare Bowditch, an ARIA Award-winning singer, songwriter, actor, speaker, writer, creative business mentor, and a broadcaster on Melbourne's
That
ABC
thing about
radio
the actor
station.
was a bit of a stretch, come on. Oh, they had one role, but anyway.
Just take it.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks. Got it. Done.
Let's face it, if I was a bloke, I'd claim to be really good at acting. She's had top 10 albums, been named Rolling Stone Woman of the Year, Yen Young Woman of the Year, co-written with Gotye, toured with Leonard Cohen, written for Harper's Bazaar and The Drum, and played in countless venues, festivals and truck stops in Australia. From 2016 to 2017, Clare hosted the afternoons program on ABC Melbourne, taking over from Richard Stubbs. Currently, Clare is writing and recording her 6th solo album and also preparing her debut book, both set for release in 2019. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you.
Finally, Bri Lee. Bri, I think they probably worked out who you are by now, but is a freelance writer for publications including The Guardian, Griffith Review, Crikey, and many more. She's the author of Eggshell Skull, a memoir lifting the lid on sexism and systematic injustice in the Australian legal industry. She is qualified to practice law, but does not, and was the and was the inaugural Cat Muscat Fellow and a 2017 Griffith Review Fellow. So, welcome, Bri. So I will now hand over to tonight's host, broadcaster, journalist and writer Francis Leach, and the panel. Please join me again in welcoming them all.
Thanks, Keith.
And welcome here to our latest Bold Thinking Series event. Always great to have you here. We will have an hour of conversation on the stage, and then we will throw the floor open to you to ask questions of the panel. So that's also a very important part of tonight's event. This conversation is a conversation. It's not the total conversation on what is obviously a large, varied and contested issue. So with that in mind, I'm going to kick things off and say, Beatrice, when you let people know on your Facebook account that you were doing this Bold Thinking Series event and this was the topic, what sort of response did you get?
Well, I mean, it wasn't so much on my own personal Facebook feed, but in the advertising for this event, there was a Facebook advertisement for tonight, and I think there was something like 900 comments. Lots of people arguing with each other because the question was, is feminism still necessary? You know, do we still need feminism? And lots of people chiming in saying, no, we've solved the problem of gender inequality, at least in Western nations. Feminists should stop wasting their time arguing about gender equality in Australia and in Western countries and just focus on the Middle East.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. It's been a great event. No, I'm only joking. Were you surprised by the range of responses?
I mean, not really. I've seen this all before. We've all seen it before on the internet. Certainly being a feminist and talking to people about these issues, I've come across these viewpoints many times where people just believe that because we have laws now that prevent any kind of discrimination, I can see you laughing, swing to you next, that, it's problem solved. But I mean, as a psychologist myself, as a researcher, I'm acutely aware of just how much prejudice there is, not just gender prejudice, but all kinds of prejudice, racism and homophobia, all kinds of things. And laws don't solve these problems. The cultural norms about, beliefs about the inferiority of women and attitudes around women's competence in various domains, as well as issues to do with sexual harassment and assault. I mean, they're alive and well. We've definitely made some progress, but my God, we have a long way to go.
Bri, one of the side topics of tonight's conversation is, are women's voices being heard? It was fascinating to watch what's gone on in federal parliament over the last couple of weeks in relation to the Liberal women in particular who've very publicly and strongly spoken about bullying, and having seen that battered back by their male colleagues. And also one female Liberal member in New South Wales who said women want the prize but they don't want the fight. So are women's voices being heard?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and it's similar to a conversation that was happening, I want to say about 2 years ago, when people first started doing that really good data on Q&A and finding that women were interrupted significantly more than men by other panellists, and also that women were being given less time to speak. And that was it was interesting to hear the producers of that program say things like, we always invite plenty of women, but they don't want to come on the show, perhaps. And then people in public would suggest that, women just don't enjoy that or don't like that kind of combative, argumentative environment. Not yet being able to acknowledge that actually women get kicked a lot more in that combative environment. It's not the case that everyone has an even playing field and chicks just don't dig it. It's a problem that everyone is in that playing field and women are getting beaten down a lot more than men. And it's incredibly frustrating to have a number of incredibly powerful, prominent women come out and describe behaviours of systemic bullying and harassment by men, and to have men then say that that's not a problem.
Jenny, in your vast experience, I mean, you were at Berkeley in the 60s, so you were there, I guess...
I can't even imagine what you're saying.
In California, at the rise of the first wave of feminism as well, and you would have worked in institutions which maybe gave lip service to gender equality, but structurally didn't actually have the structural right to actually empower women. How did you look at the recent events in relation to the way those women were summarily dismissed and their serious allegations and claims weren't even really dealt with?
Well, I think it's just par for the course. I'm not sure that much has changed in the last 50 years. Certainly when I was at Berkeley, feminism, we all read Female Eunuch and The Second Sex, but feminism was pretty far down the agenda. I mean, really it was anti-war, anti-racism that motivated most students. And I came from Adelaide when I was kind of used to being ignored and put down, so nothing changed. And I think perhaps the same things are going on all the time. I think if you'd asked me then, have you ever experienced sexism, I would have said, oh, no. But, looking back, there's just every single day, every single time, every single meeting, every single chance I had to say anything, there would be either ignoring me or interrupting me. So it seems like nothing much has changed at that level.
Claire, your experience of it in the music industry, because it's interesting. I've been fascinated how the music industry in Australia to this point has not been the subject of a more thorough, investigation, or at least look at, particularly in relation to the Me Too movement. Because my experience of it was, when I look back on it now, that it was entrenched.
It's coming.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's taken this long.
All right, so what's happening with the conversation at the moment? Just to hands up, who's ever been to a festival, a music festival? Okay, great. Has anyone ever noticed that there seemed to be a minority of females or female-led bands on music festivals? Just a little raised hands. Does anyone sort of you don't have to raise your hands for this, but perhaps some of you haven't noticed that, or that hasn't really been something that's ticked in your mind because it's just been accepted, that's the way it is. Now, my experience of music festivals has been that I was often the anomaly. I was often invited to play music festivals, but I knew that I was paid less than my peers who were male. I knew that because my booking agent, Scotty, told me that. I knew that whenever it came to the question of who would headline or otherwise, again, if I was on a comparable level with a gentleman or a male-led band, I knew that it was assumed they would go first. I knew that I'd be called a bitch, a difficult woman, a troublemaker, and all sorts of things behind my back if I did put up my hand and say, actually, I don't know that, I think maybe we need to have a discussion about that. And I was warned when I went on Q&A as the first musical guest about 10 years ago that, yet again, if I did want to get a word in, I was sat next to Corey Bernardi, if I did want to get a word in, I was going to have to be prepared to feel like I was being a bitch, because, again, there's something about being outspoken and feeling like we're being a bitch that seemed to be coupled together with being an Australian and a woman and in a position of power in some degree, or trying to vie for a position of power. So what's happening in the music industry at the moment is very, very interesting and quite hopeful in a way. There's a younger generation of musicians who, thanks to the internet, no longer have to go through the record companies or even radio stations. They can find their audience directly through social media or so on. Therefore, they have the right to say whatever they want. They're not pleasing anyone else. And what they're saying is, this is bullshit. Why on a show, on a festival, a big blues festival in Queensland, are there 27 men and 3 women? What's going on there? So this is musicians like Camp Cope and then on the other hand, curiously, I'm very close to the number of festival organisers who are saying it's really difficult to find the right balance on festival bills, and we're not quite sure how to do it yet. And so there's all this awkwardness, but something's moving. There's a bit of truth being told. So I think that's hopeful, but it makes me sad that it's taken this long to even get that little bit of a conversation going.
Did you always have to sort of self-censor or adjust your behaviour and the way you thought and acted to accommodate, to get by?
Okay, so this might sound quite calculated in retrospect, but I only started my music career after becoming a mother at 27. My husband and I were in a band together. He's been my manager, my producer, and so on. So we're a 2-person team called Clare Bowditch at the front. And I always knew that there was some degree in any career, I'm just going to say it out loud. In any career, sometimes the trick to getting anywhere is to see how much shit you can eat for the first few years. Okay, and I don't know if that's a male thing or a female thing. I think this is partly an apprenticeship thing, but I knew that if I was going to be this anomaly, which is a female in Australia who has a lifelong career, I mean, you can count on 2 hands the amount that we have, and that was always my hope, that I was going to have to mute myself for a number of years until I was in a position to be able to say what I wanted. Now, it wasn't a matter of tricking anyone or so on, but I always knew my agenda was, this is odd. Why am I the only one in this room? Or why is it me and Sarah Blasco who constantly get confused just because we both happen to be females? Like all of that kind of stuff. So I knew that a time would come where I get to be able to have that conversation, but I had to be a little bit quiet for 5 years.
Is that your experience as a writer too?
As a lawyer, yes.
As a lawyer.
Became a writer so that I didn't have to zip my lip as a lawyer.
Well, tell us about that then. We're getting into the realm of, I guess, structural inequities and well ingrained structural inequities in a profession like the law, which is has a long history and would be very slow to change.
Yeah, it's. I don't want to get too philosophical, but I find
go right ahead.
Thank you. I find it incredibly frustrating that the premise of a common law system is that it is growing and changing and adapting with society to reflect and serve its people, and yet all of the people in that industry are just bolted on and are so resistant to change and update. It is ironic and frustrating. When I started my legal career, I finished law school and I started as a judge's associate. I certainly did not. I had always loved reading and writing, and I was writing as a hobby, but I didn't start that job thinking, I'll get a book out of this. I still really thought that I would go to the bar and practice law. And then, within a couple of weeks, I was just meticulously taking notes, because ironically everything in a courtroom is recorded, but I felt like no one was bearing witness. And there were patterns emerging immediately. Every week we would have a new trial and a handful of new sentences. And the repetition of older male defendants preying on younger female complainants is undeniable. And I got to the end of the year and I knew that I couldn't accept the way it was. And so I sat down and for a few weeks I had a long, hard think, and I looked at what would lay ahead of me in sort of 10, 30, 50 years if I kept with the legal profession. And I felt like I could make a lot more change from outside of the system than I could from within it, and that I would have to toe the line for so many decades before I got into any kind of position of power where I could make change within that structure. And so I quit.
And here you are, and have written a book which we're going to give away a little later on too. Someone's going to walk away with a copy of Bri's book. Can I talk a little bit about the sort of work you've done though? Let's take it back to the issue of gender and our chromosomes. And when you were writing your groundbreaking work on on what makes us men and what makes us women and everything else in between as well. Was there resistance to science as being part of the conversation when it comes to gender and gendered behaviour?
I didn't meet that resistance within science at all. I got into this field totally accidentally. I was actually trying to work on the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. I didn't bother about. but then we accidentally got pulled into the search for the sex-determining gene, and it was my student who actually found that gene when he went to London.
You just happened to stumble across it.
Well, no, there had been a candidate for it, and we were sent that and told to, please show that this is on the Y chromosome in Australian animals too. So we looked at it and it was not on the Y chromosome, it was the wrong gene. And so that sort of shifted everything, and that meant that we got into the race, and it was my student who won that race to find that gene. So that was all very, very directed research, and there really was, of course, there was a lot of public interest in, oh yes, we've got the sex-determining gene, and now we'll discover everything. And it has not been that easy. It's quite a complex. There's a gene on the Y chromosome that makes the embryo male, and makes that embryo have a testis. The testis makes hormones, and it's the hormones that make the baby male. But we all know that there's lots of things that can happen during that very complex web of, it's quite a push-me-pull-you, that whole network of how a gene affects other genes, that affects other genes, that affects hormones, that affects other genes. In fact, there's something like 1/3 of the entire genome is expressed differently in men and women. So it has a huge effect. And I think gradually we become better known in the community. But when I first met, it was when I first published my idea that the Y chromosome was disappearing, which it is in evolutionary sense. Don't worry, guys. It's going to take 4.5 million years at the rate it's going.
Not fast enough for some.
And so I thought it was pretty funny to call one of my popular articles, a feminist view of the Y chromosome. And then I started getting some amazing letters from please contribute to our volumes. And I didn't even understand some of these letters. There was one that used the word hermeneutic twice in the first sentence. So I knew I was in the wrong company here. But I've always had a lot of input as far as I can go. Anybody who's interested in biological differences between the sexes, anybody who's interested in the role of genes in mate choice, that is homosexuality, or gender identity, I'm very willing to make suggestions and pull out data.
But Beatrice, I read your article in the conversation today about the sort of work that Jenny has been pioneering, and that there's a resistance to, in some way, including that in the conversation about the way men and women behave as a consequence of their genetic makeup. That somehow that becomes, a cop-out, particularly for men, when it comes to taking responsibility for their behaviour.
Yeah, you get all sorts of views on this particular question. There's a lot of resistance to talking about gender differences among feminists. And part of that is just this belief that, the human mind at birth is a blank slate, and that everything about human psychology is a result of experience. And myself and quite a few people in psychology are not convinced of that at all. We know that the brain is built by genes. It's not just, some kind of blank computer that you just program through your day-to-day life. It's we've got all kinds of instinctive behaviours that are natural and partly genetically determined, but also influenced by our experiences. And I think that a lot of the gender differences that we observe, so the kind of average gender differences that we observe, do partly have a genetic basis.
Well, give us an example, particularly from that we can relate to, that might illustrate what you're talking about.
Well, that latest article that I wrote was focusing more around kind of dominance and submission behaviour. So we do find kind of quite stable personality differences between men and women. Women tend to be more agreeable, which is not a bad thing at all. Agreeableness is actually quite a positive trait to have. But, you know, men tend to be higher on these more kind of dominating, like interpersonal dominance and social dominance orientation, these kinds of traits. So it probably explains a lot of the differences that we see between men and women. And
Are you saying men are from Mars and women are from Venus?
Absolutely
correct?
not. No, it's actually not what I'm saying. And this is,
joking.
yeah,
But do you, the damage that a sort of cliche like that can do to your work?
it's done a lot of damage. I mean, this is the conclusion that people jump to, that just because you say that there's a difference on average, and we're talking about sometimes, you know, a very small difference. You know, you've got a personality test, it's measured on a scale of 0 to 100, and you could just be talking about a few points or even less of a difference. You know, you've got two overlapping bell curves, and actually there's just a lot of similarity, but on average there's a statistically significant difference. And that explains a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that women and men are categorically different. They're absolutely not. There's a lot in common as well. So I think people do have trouble wrapping their heads around that particular issue, and just some basic knowledge of statistics and probability would probably fix that. Yeah, so, you know, there is resistance to this idea that there are some kind of underlying genetic differences between at least the psychology of women and men, because I think we accept that there are physical differences. That's uncontroversial. But, yeah, people think that because of that, gender equality is just never going to happen, that it's inevitable that men dominate women, and that's never going to change, and there's nothing we can do to fix that. I think that we can. I have no doubt that we can fix that issue. But a lot of people don't even acknowledge that it's a problem in the first place.
Well, Jenny, when we spoke before the lecture, you told me you got a lot of pushback, particularly with your pioneering work on this issue from people in the feminist movement who were affronted by the fact that you'd raised this issue.
Well, at one stage, I volunteered to give sex lectures on biological sex differences to a course. It was a degree course, I think, about feminism. And I never heard back, so that's a bit strange. So I wrote another memo, and I never heard back either. And I found out later that no, there are no biological differences between men and women, so I'm wasting my time. But I honestly think that it's silly to deny that there are differences in averages, and the differences in height, and nobody worries too much about that. There are tall women and short men, and it's the same with the brain. So I do think it's time to stop arguing about whether there are or aren't and how much these differences are. There's genetic differences in everything, and it doesn't just stop at the neck either. You know, there are obviously genetic differences that influence behaviour of all kinds, sexual behaviour as well.
And I don't think women should worry. I don't think you should ever feel threatened if someone starts to talk about the differences between men and women, as if you think that any difference implies that women are inferior. Quite the opposite. I'm firmly of the opinion that the genetic differences between women and men, if anything, and I hope this isn't too controversial, but if anything, it implies that women are superior in many significant ways. Don't you think?
I defer to your superior knowledge, obviously. Hearing this, Bri, I mean, it's interesting. Has there been, within some elements of the feminist movement, a problem with the science? And how is that to be accommodated? Because it feels that in some sense, if you accept the science, you open a door for excuse for men and their behaviour. That, you know, they're built this way, and therefore that's the way it is. A bit like what we've seen in Parliament once again, where we've heard senior parliamentarians say, well, you know, this is the roughhouse nature of parliamentary politics. If you can't handle it, get another job.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't see that amongst my peers. Amongst my peers, so I'm in my mid-20s. Yep. There's a lot of eye rolling at anyone who's not willing to take science into account alongside social issues. I don't know. That's sort of one of those. I think that might be one of the chasms between some older feminists and what I see as my peer group of young feminists who aren't afraid of combining science with social issues. No, I don't. Is anyone else?
I've been to a feminist panel, where one of the speakers said outright, we have to end all discussion of biological gender differences. Like, we just cannot talk about this.
For that reason that I mentioned.
Yeah, and then eugenics and, all these kinds of things, yeah.
That's a rather frightening place to be. But we do live in an age where science is questioned. I mean, we have people who still think climate change was invented by George Soros. So, science is under attack, Claire. So rational thought is it's not, we can't presume it, can we?
Well, we can't. The thing is that when we, deep within this conversation is that other conversation that, human to human, we're quite different. I mean, each person, and you mentioned this before, we have some tall women and shorter men, and each one of us is different. And I guess at the heart of the conversation is, are we able to accommodate different types of power in this world? I think that is essentially what we're asking. I remember when I was a kid, and I had this really interesting experience with power as a woman. And I'll just tell a little story from my childhood, which has come up recently because I've been at home writing this book about childhood. And it was a funny lesson to get. So I was 10, I was in grade 4 at Sacred Heart Catholic Girls and Boys College. It was a co-ed school over in Sandringham. And I was overweight, and I was sick of being overweight. I was also a lot taller than anyone else in my class, including the boys. I could beat them in arm wrestles. I actually had no idea that there were genetic, physical differences between men and women, and I didn't believe there were for many, many years to come. I, in fact, had an argument with a friend at 14 who said, no, men are generally stronger than women. I said, that's a lie, and really didn't have a sense of that. But I was 10 and I was overweight and I was tired of it, and I was in grade 4, and I went away for the school holidays and I begged my mum to take me to the diet doctor, and she did, and I was put on a very extreme diet. And I came back from the school holidays and I'd grown about this much, and I was rake thin, and I walked through the school gates. And I said to my librarian, hello, Mrs. Smith. And she said, hello, have we met before? And I said, it's me, Clare Bowditch. And the look on her face was just, what? Wow, where did you go? And this experience was repeated again and again and again. And the mothers in the class came to me and asked for the diet. And I would photocopy it in the office. I asked for permission to, and handed it out to the mothers. I didn't really know what I was doing, and it was a woman came up to me, and for the first time in my life I was told, you're actually quite beautiful. Someone besides your mother saying that. All of a sudden I had the world being interested in me because my body shape had changed. Now, I don't judge that. It's not, I understand that we're curious about that. But I was invited then into rooms and into experiences as a young woman that weren't accessible to me before then, as someone who was invisible because of her size. And it confused the fuck out of me. Really, really did. And at the same time, my sister was a model and she was in Dolly magazine and other things. So I got this very, very strong lesson very, very young, that if you're smaller, if your body size is smaller, you have more power and agency in the world. Now, that's an anxious thought for a woman going through puberty to experience, because I don't know if you know this, but we actually don't get our periods as women unless we put on enough weight to accommodate the hormones that require us to then be able to have our period. So it created this sort of anxious relationship with power and body size right throughout my life. And I know I'm not the only one to have experienced that, male or female, but it does seem to be of particular prominence and a particularly weighty question, excuse the pun, for women in the world, again, with power. Is there a space for people at different sizes? And why is it that we equate female power so often with a smaller body, regardless of the field?
So it is that about the overlay, the cultural overlay of, if you talk about the science of the genetic difference, there's a cultural overlay of what we value and what we don't value, and that
Correct.
Isn't scientific. That is chosen by the power dynamic within our communities.
Yeah,
so is that changing at all? Have we seen any real change in that?
I think science
wonder.
doesn't really have the answers to that question. And as a scientist, I certainly never had the answer to that question. I spent most of my university career trying to be a blonde bimbo, very unsuccessfully.
But Jenny, there would be a reason why you did that. There would be a clever reason why you did that.
Desperation to fit in.
Yeah.
So you were trying to play dumb?
Yeah,
You're not
absolutely.
good at that. You're too smart.
I got quite good at that.
Oh, okay.
But Jenny, were you
I
trying
think
to...
I was quite dumb at that stage.
I was wondering, were you trying to play dumb because that was a way to be allowed in?
Accepted, absolutely.
Which
Yep.
seems like a smartish thing to do, really, to me.
Well, it seemed like the only thing
That's
to do if I
right.
wanted to find some little niche for my life.
I always found it particularly heartbreaking and interesting to see that on both sides of the courtroom, you could have a complainant, like a witness in the box, and a barrister or a solicitor. And both those women, the better they looked, the better they were able to hold court. And the way our society currently quite uniquely fat shames women in a way that leads to, like, the beauty ideal is an ethical ideal. We think that people who are fat, that is representative of their personality. And we think that someone who is overweight must be lazy and lack self-discipline. The effect it has, how critically women are judged based on their appearance, affects whether we think that they are believable, whether we think that they are desirable, and those things also then directly affect rape myths and narratives that courtrooms, in particular juries, are like looking out for. And it also affects solicitors and barristers, women in the legal profession, because women are just judged so much more critically on their appearance and are judged so appallingly if they are overweight. It is, new research is coming out about, I'm sure it happens in every profession, but specifically eating disorders in the legal profession. It's mind-blowing.
So you say this is quite different for men and women? Being a fat man is better than being a fat woman?
Well, from what I've read, people are, regardless of their gender, are fat shamed, but there is just so much more emphasis put on a woman's appearance compared to a man's appearance. It is just under a more intense magnifying glass. Yes.
So in a way, despite the raft of legislation that's been passed and the public consciousness raising we've had to try to address these issues and to at least create a more level playing field in a circumstance like the one you've just described, sexism seems like a virus that still finds a willing host. That it can still find a way. There's something that will find a way into a social dynamic. How do we start to find a way to combat that? We can't legislate away ignorance and prejudice.
No, but there are so many things we can do to make it so much better. For a start, one really, really super simple thing. I spoke on Radio National a few months ago with a woman called Ms. Horan, who's basically Australia's leading expert on juries. And it is a common misconception that juries and the selection and the running of juries the way they are now needs to stay that way because that's where they've always been. But actually we adopted the jury system at the point of invasion when we adopted the rest of common law from the UK, and it was from when jurors could only be 12 land-owning men of good character who knew the defendant. So
That fourth one.
Yeah. So there is certainly, again, it's this frustrating thing about the law, in its essence, always changing and growing and updating to serve us. And a particularly frustrating thing I saw that I documented in my book was that in Queensland, defence and prosecution each get 8 preemptive challenges. So that's when the associate pulls a name out of the barrel. That was my job. In the time it took someone to walk from the back of the courtroom to the front where the seats were, the counsel, prosecution or defence, could call out challenge and give absolutely no reason. And that means that they got the name, postcode, profession, and look of a potential juror. In my year, overwhelmingly, I saw defence barristers use up most, if not all, of their challenges. If it was an adult sex crime trial, of which I saw many, they would typically challenge women and young people. In Victoria, you are only allowed, it was decreased from 8 to 4 preemptive challenges because we've acknowledged that 8 is a lot and has a really big effect on the composition of a jury. In Queensland, we still have 8, and I just want to hit home how funny and interesting it is that in the UK, where we got this system from, they have abolished preemptive challenges altogether. So there are a myriad small, pragmatic changes that can and ought to be made to the legal industry and the cogs of the justice system that would go a long way in making up for the issues that it currently faces.
It has been an extraordinary couple of years in terms of digital activism. To put it mildly, it's changed, the landscape in the conversation in such a dramatic way. Reflective of the power of digital media because it's transnational. It can reach people regardless of their social and economic circumstances in a way that old media could never have done. The whole Me Too movement. I want to just run around the panel to get your reflections on if in any way it has changed the conversation in a good way. Which way do you think, or in what ways do you think it has? We'll start with you, Beatrice.
Well, awareness. I mean, just giving a voice to people that haven't always had a voice. Conventional media has been controlled largely, and still is controlled largely, by middle-aged men. So social media and hashtag activism means that anyone in the world with an internet connection can speak up. And that's exactly what we saw with the Me Too movement, is that women were speaking up about experiences that had, by and large, been ignored up until now. And I think it is very powerful. And there has been some early research on the Me Too movement, and it has been finding that women do feel a sense of solidarity with other women in just sharing their experiences and realising that they're not alone, that they're not the only ones that have gone through sexual harassment and assault, and that it's not individual to them. There's nothing personal to them why they were harassed or assaulted. It's a systemic issue that almost all women have experienced, if not all. So just that, I guess, the sense of vindication in knowing that you're not alone, is actually quite reassuring, and it helps to alleviate a lot of the stigma that comes with being sexually harassed or assaulted. So I think that the Me Too movement has made a huge difference. I know there are some detractors who think that it hasn't made a difference or it hasn't made enough of a difference. I think we're still yet to see what kind of difference it's going to make, but I think so far the impact has been huge. I have no doubt about that.
Jenny, your reflections on?
I'd certainly agree. I think it has made a difference, and I certainly follow some of it and think yes. But I'm also worried about some of the effects it has on people who I think don't deserve it. I do know of one man who was sacked because he was accused of looking at a woman's breasts. But I know him, he always looks at his feet. He's just a very shy, Asperger-y kind of a guy. And I do worry that there might be grave injustices done. I also worry a bit that some of the things that are coming out, I would have said were just so trivial. I mean, who hasn't been groped under the table at a conference, for heaven's sakes? And I think...
Jesus, stop! What? Yeah. Hang on, that's huge what you just said, Jenny. Just unpack that for me a bit. So, no, but really,
Well...
who hasn't been groped under a table at a conference?
Oh,
funny,
you poor thing.
me.
That's if that happened to my daughter, I'd be upset about it. But for
well,
you,
I'd like my daughter to know how to handle it, which is generally to laugh uproariously and smack him.
Right.
I've found. There've been so many occasions like that all over the world, and if you take it seriously, you just will die.
How do we not?
I'd just like to quickly.
You've really. I've found. One of the best weapons is laughing at somebody for doing something inappropriate.
Laughing in people's faces can be really powerful, but I just want to take a moment and let everybody know that if somebody touches you uninvited, particularly in a sexual way, that's literally a crime, and you can bat them away and then you can report them to the police. and that I would say that that is also a great way to deal with it.
Clare, your experience of it, as someone also in the media, and I guess if you, as you said about your experience on Q&A and whatnot, if you do engage with the wider community on social media, your experience of how the Me Too digital movement has transformed the conversation or the dynamic in the conversation?
2 points. So one, on a personal level, I have a husband who is 6'4". It had never, ever once in his life occurred to him that to walk across a park in the middle of the night might be a frightening thing to do. So I remember when Me Too first struck, it affected him and his friendship group deeply in terms of their conversation. And I remember him posting something on Facebook, which was, I just never thought of it. So, you know, this has made me think of it in a different way. It's just one tiny example. Does that mean that, you know, we now have guards at the front and the end of a park? No, nothing's actually changed for a woman who is walking through a park in the middle of the night. But there is something that changes when people are made aware of that. For example, my husband. It was nice to hear him say that, but I was amazed that it had never occurred to him to not feel safe in the world. Like, I walk into this room, I've already scanned the room of, you know, who looks slightly dangerous or threatening to me. Why do I do that? I worked in the media for 2 years. When you work at the ABC, you have a screen in front of you which is called a text line. I tried my hardest to put on a fantastic show every day, and a balanced show, and a show that would keep people company and that would challenge ideas and thoughts and so on. But every time we mentioned anything to do with the Me Too movement, or in fact every time there was a female guest on the show, or each time I hosted, you have a text screen that is 20 fantastic comments to one horrific comment about my child, about rape, about the terrible job that I'm doing. Okay, and so there is a defensiveness that has to come up. That, you know, if I reported that to my supervisors and it was aggressive and repeated, it might be looked into. But, you know, we saw a couple of weeks ago another presenter, a fellow presenter on ABC in Brisbane, weeping on air because of some of the comments that she received. And that was the first sort of time I'd heard it mentioned that maybe this was an issue. So I can't undo what I saw in terms of reaction from the world to Me Too. It's not, clearly not everyone's into it.
It's amplified the discussion in good ways, but also in really dangerous ways as well, hasn't it? And it is a case, is it not, that women in the digital space are more likely to be attacked, are more likely to feel that it's a dangerous place. Is there a safe place for the conversation online?
It's not a safe conversation. It's a deeply uncomfortable, unsettling conversation for all. For those who wanted the world to stay the way it was, and those who have the chance to speak about the world that they know and tell the truth for the first time. I don't know if where's a safe space? It's not going to be easy.
And whose responsibility is it to make it a safe space? It's not the women complaining, it's men, surely.
Well, I mean, partly in response to that question, and partly in response to you, Jenny, the comment that you made about men doing things like groping women under the table. I mean, would you agree that that kind of behaviour stems from a fundamental disrespect and a sense of entitlement?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And should it be challenged?
Yes, and there are probably many levels at which it can be challenged, not just smacking the hand.
But I mean, sort of actively calling out, through things like digital activism and, writing articles and writing books and all these kinds of things we do. I mean, because you sort of raise that point as a criticism of the Me Too movement.
Not a criticism so much. I think it does trivialise serious problems.
Right.
I read some of these stories and they're just heartbreaking. And that just doesn't equate to me having some fella squeezing my knee.
No, they're
You don't see
definitely
the-
different.
Do you
But
see them as linked in any way? Because I think what you're saying is really important, Jenny, because I think this is the way a lot of people think. And I also think that's a really strong survival mechanism that has had to be adopted by women over the years to survive in environments. I think that's what I'm hearing for you, from you. Certainly no criticism of that, but it also completely breaks my heart to hear you say that we shouldn't make a fuss about those things, because I think they're symptomatic. I think they're on the same continuum.
Oh, I would
Yeah.
agree they're on the same continuum.
Yeah.
But there's many other things going on. I mean, generally there will be other kinds of relationships being forged at that table as
Yes.
well. And I agree that there's elements of disrespect, but there's also elements of interest and respect as well.
I just want to add my 2 cents with regards to the idea of smaller complaints trivialising more serious complaints. So, like 1 in 5 women at least, I'm a survivor of a sex crime. A sex crime was committed against me when I was a child, but I took it to court as an adult. So I was cross-examined on the premise that I was a liar, but I am grateful that I did not have to argue around consent because I was a child. So as someone who has survived and prosecuted what I would agree is undeniably on the serious end of things, one thing I have absolutely loved seeing about the Me Too movement is the small things being picked up upon. And I feel like I can say that because I have survived the really, really shitty end of things. And I would never, ever use the word trivialise, because I think only by drawing attention to all points upon that spectrum can we understand the magnitude of the problem. And when Me Too exploded, I had just received a trial date. And I couldn't add my Me Too story because I couldn't jeopardise ongoing legal proceedings. But I wept like a baby for days as that movement really exploded in Australia, reading all of those people's stories. Because I had this, from the big, really big, serious ones to the really, air quote marks for audio recording, small ones, because I felt like I was part of something. And I will absolutely disagree with the word trivialise used in any situation of gendered inappropriate conduct.
And sorry, I'll just add to that the psychological research really backs this up. That, you know, even these instances of what people perceive to be quite minor are still damaging. They have a way of getting under the skin. So there's a whole theory called minority stress theory, that just by belonging to a group that is minoritised or stigmatised, even those really minor instances of discrimination or stigma or disrespect or whatever it is, they do have a way of causing psychological distress, because, you know, it's not just one incident. It's often a collection of many, many small incidents, and drop by drop the pot fills, you know, and the stress of that does build up, and you're just constantly being sent the signal that you're not respected. That's what that does. That's what that kind of thing does, just being groped under the table. You're being told you're not respected, and that can be profoundly damaging to people. So it might seem minor on the surface, but actually, in reality, the empirical data suggests otherwise.
I just looked at the clock. I can't believe the hour's flown by as quickly as it has. It's been a conversation that we could do for another hour, but I want to invite you to be part of it. But I do want to raise one more area that I'm desperate to talk about, because I think it's crucial and we haven't discussed it, and that's the power of economics. And that whilst the economic superstructure is as it is, then real empowerment for women will be something of a distant dream. How important is changing the fundamental economics for women and their access to economic freedom and power to a real sense of liberation?
Well, it's definitely made a huge difference already. I mean, just in the last century, we've come a long way in women's liberation from all the kinds of economic constraints that they had in the past. But there's still a long way to go. But I don't think that's all there is to it. I think that's one aspect of it. But again, you know, I keep bringing it back to this because I'm a psychologist and this is what I do, that, you know, fundamentally at the heart of it, we do just need to change people's attitudes.
Rick?
A huge effect. So one thing that is sexism and racism are spoken about with regards to legal and justice issues a fair amount. Something that's not often spoken about is classism, and the incredible extra sort of discolouring sheet of difficulty that poverty puts on top of an already really tough uphill battle to try and get justice is really, really intense and really awful. Particularly, it's an issue also in regional and remote communities. In that year that I was an associate, we went out to, I think, 7 or 8 different regional towns in Queensland. And the kind of things we would hear is, a woman in the stand who's a witness for a really, really serious maintaining unlawful sexual relationship with a child charge against her ex-partner. So she'll say something like, yeah, I didn't think he was, I knew the girls were uncomfortable with him, but he was the first man within a year after having 4 other partners who would provide for us. It was the first time we didn't have to move house again for a 4th time within a year. The overlay of financial issues for women in terms of trying to access justice is a real problem. And the other quick thing I'll say as someone on the panel from Queensland is that I have an article coming out in the Saturday paper this weekend because Queensland is at the moment the closest we've ever been to potentially decriminalising abortion. And in effect in Queensland, it's much, much harder. I was going to say it's easier for women who have money in Brisbane to access a termination. For a woman who does not have money and is not in a major city, it is extremely difficult. And what it means is that she can go to her local doctor, and because it's illegal and because they might be anti-abortion, they will tell her that she has no options. She'll go home and she'll Google it and find out that she can get a termination if she travels to Brisbane or interstate. And she then takes some time to gather the money to do that, and then the travelling time. And it means that by the time she is able to access a termination, she's further along, and it becomes more physically and psychologically risky for that woman trying to access a termination. And it also means she's much more likely to be showing, which you can imagine is an issue in a regional or remote town. So there are all kinds of different ways where women not getting paid as much money as men and having their money controlled by their partners has colossal, life-changing negative impacts on them.
Okay.
Whew.
No, it's been a great conversation. Before we go to the floor, I want to just ask this: are we optimistic that change has been slow in coming, but is still in motion? Do you have a sense of optimism, Clare, that despite all of the challenges we've outlined up here tonight, that the arc of history is bending towards the good rather than the bad?
I'm violently optimistic, but I believe that arc is long. Yeah. So I can't predict today what I'll see in my lifetime. I'm not sure about that just yet. But I can say, as a mother of a 15-year-old daughter, that she, as someone who's just spent 6 months reading through my diaries at her age, she's in a very different position generationally than I was. I'd never even seen a goddamn female surfer, I had no expectation of equal pay. So all of these kind of things that were taken for granted at my time, the equivalent of what we've spoken about today, the things that were common experiences that we accepted as okay, she does not accept as okay, and that gives me great hope.
Okay, that's a good note to finish our conversation on, and then invite you now to join the conversation. So we have 2 microphones, one on either side of the room. The way that we do this is that we ask you to ask questions and not make statements, because that doesn't really help our panel in joining in the discussion. And to just stick your hand in the air, introduce yourself and ask away. So there's Somebody down the front straight away.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Harley. I'm a student at Monash University. My question is about the topic of, I guess, intersectionality and how feminism and sexism and the different way women are treated varies depending on other lacks of privilege, like other instances of racism, as Bri was saying, classism, and the different experiences of trans women. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Well, can I first of all say that there's no data at all, but I will bet you anything that there are genes that predispose people to have a strong female or a strong male identity. And if those gene variants, if a strong female identity variants come along with a Y chromosome, you're transgender. And I think we're going to learn a lot more about many biological differences that essentially mean that transgenderism is part of the normal spectrum. And I'd love to think that that would make a huge difference in the way that we look at transgender. And I think the same is true of homosexuality too. I've written in the conversation that I think homosexual genes are not gay genes, they're male-loving genes, and there are going to be hundreds of them. Any evolutionary biologist will tell you that there'll be male-loving genes and female-loving genes. Everybody's got a mixture. It's like being extra tall or extra short. And I'd love to think that an understanding of the huge variety that we call normal will change people's attitudes.
So we'll lose our binary choice.
Well, I think, yes, it's like tallness and shortness. There's not a binary.
Thank you for your question. I think we've got it. Somebody over this no? Feel free to stick your hand in there and ask away. There's somebody up the back there as well.
Lady in stripes.
Claire's going to sing you in each time. You set the precedent now.
Thank you. Germaine Greer came out recently and said that she believed in shorter sentencing for rapists.
Sorry, say that one more time, Doctor.
Germaine Greer came out recently and advocated for shorter sentencing in raping convictions.
That was interesting, wasn't it?
It was good. But I suppose in the light that there is such few convictions for rapists, does she have a point? And I have no idea, and I'm not making any comments.
Can I take this one?
You can.
Why not?
This is right in your ballpark.
Oh, God.
That comment is a small snippet from her latest publication titled On Rape, published by Melbourne University Press. It's about 11,000 words. I spent 2,000 words talking about it on Crikey. She sort of tries to suggest that somehow by reducing the severity of the sentence, we will increase the rate of conviction. And there is no data to suggest that. And that offends against several really important legal principles. And I also don't know anyone who's ever worked in the law or taken the time to speak to someone who's worked in the law who would think that those things would actually correlate in that way. I do not agree, but what I will say is that I find it incredibly frustrating when we have a high-profile sex offence case and the media/public outcry response, the sort of angry mob with the pitchforks say that
It's
the
about
sentencing
two
is
and a
not
half
enough.
People, by the way. It's often, we imagine it this mob. It's sort of a couple of angry.
Oh, I don't know. No, I feel like lots of people get angry when they hear about the case.
Very loud.
Yeah.
Loud and angry.
And people want more extreme sentencing for people convicted of sex crimes, is what I was going to say.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
I can understand that being an sort of automatic urge response, that we want to demonize and lock away those people. We have to try to rise above that immediate response. as somebody that got the men who committed a sex crime against them convicted, the main two things we need to try and focus on are prevention and rehabilitation, because those two things, those two principles are the only way we will actually decrease offending in the future. And so what I will say is that I do not believe we need to reduce sentences, but we need to move further and more complex in the way we talk about those sort of like angry responses we have in the media and amongst each other in response to high-profile cases.
Were you disappointed that the Brisbane Writers' Festival withdrew their invitation to agree to discuss that? I mean, in terms of that's a conversation that the response that needed to be had you just gave us, but it seemed once again that the conversation wasn't allowed to be had, that there was a reluctance to deal with difficult issues.
I have two sort of thoughts about this. My first thought is how exciting it would be to program Greer on an event where she has a 30-minute in-conversation with someone and then has to answer audience questions for like an hour. And what a great way it would be to sort of let her feel like her and her publishers and free speech feel like they had the opportunity to give them a platform and simultaneously question them and hold them accountable for what they've written about. The other part of me says, this is not a person that struggles to find a platform, unlike many people who have important stories that need telling that don't get ever opportunities to speak at writers' festivals. So I think the mistake on the part of the Brisbane Writers' Festival there was ever programming her in the first place. Because as soon as you uninvite someone, then you've made a statement.
Some more questions from the room. Don't be shy. You did come here just to listen. We want to hear from you as well. Stick those hands in the air.
Thank you. I'm very hopeful that education would be a way to create change. My question is, how do we create change among the very young, say, primary school students? How do we teach feminism within a young educational setting?
Claire?
You're the psychologist, so you probably have something quite... I've got a personal anecdote, then we might go to the real stuff.
It gives me thinking time.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I've got two sons who are both 11 and they're in grade 6, and they've been having conversations about feminism since they were able to speak, and they didn't know it had a name, this thing where we talk about equality, until a few years ago when they realised that this thing was called feminism. There was a name for it where we say that there's enough room for everyone at the table, and etc. They're being taught about concepts of consent at school every day, whether we talk about it formally or informally. So my belief is that the more emphasis we can put on teaching the educators about feminism, about consent, about equality, and about how that looks, the more hope we have for this generation. So my boys, I'm saying, are particularly lucky to be at a school where that conversation is happening, in a city where that conversation is happening, in a home where that conversation is happening. But yeah, so that's one way, but that's, I think, quite a rarefied experience, to be honest.
Well, I would say science. I love science. I love science so much. And I think we should be teaching the science of these issues. In other words, just evidence. We should be talking about reality and evidence, as young as possible, teaching it to children, but yes, also teaching it to the people that teach the children and the people who have children, so parents. And, just throwing a bit of information at people, really getting the information and the science and the knowledge in people's faces so that they're really fully aware of themselves and of what goes on in society that contributes to the perpetuation of gender inequality. So the more we're aware of those subtle, discriminatory, biased things we do, like treating girls and boys differently since they're born, the more that we can avoid doing those things, the more we're going to solve this particular problem. Because even though, yes, I believe that, there are lots of things that are biologically based, doesn't mean they're biologically determined, but they just have some kind of biological basis, which might be quite minor, you know, experience matters a lot. And parents definitely treat female children and male children very, very differently. So it has to start young, it has to start with parents, and it has to start with teachers. So the more that we can educate just everybody about these issues, the further we'll get.
It's pretty hard though, isn't it, when you've got a Prime Minister and successive
Oh,
Prime Ministers
good Lord.
who've been very quick to defend religious freedom in schools, but have also been very, very vociferous in their attacks on the notion of safe schools and having a conversation around these issues. So that's how far we've got to go and to try to win that battle. There's some more questions to come. There's this gentleman at the front here.
I'm going after religion in my next conversation article.
Oh,
I'm talking about sex in the conversation tomorrow.
get your plug in here. What's the name of the new book?
I was just thinking about your statement before in relation to your experience, if you like. And do you think there's a fundamental, and I've had a similar experience myself, do you think there's a fundamental disconnect in the way in which people actually view those sorts of behaviours, that there's a misunderstanding about their importance to people or the impact that it has on people?
First of all, I'm sorry to hear that, and thank you for sharing that. But can you clarify who you think is misunderstanding?
Let's just call them men.
Do you mean to say that men don't seem to be appreciating what a significant impact these things have on people?
An empathy deficit.
Yes. Yeah, one of the... so you can probably imagine what my email inbox looks like. One of the recurring themes of messages I have received is from women who, after reading my book, have spoken to their partner for the first time about something that happened to them a long time ago. And they describe that until they shared that information with their partner, the woman did not, just sort of had made peace with the prospect that he would never able, and because these have all been heterosexual examples sent to me, that he would never be able to quite get them, to get who they are fully, to get why they respond like that sometimes, to get why they do that weird thing sometimes, to get why these situations make them feel uncomfortable. They had accepted the fact that the person they wanted to spend their life with, or certainly a long number of years with, just would never know them that fully. But it has been incredibly reassuring when I talk to those people that because of the conversation that's happening now, and even because of the better language we have around trauma, and I do believe that the National Inquiry into Institutional Child Sex Abuse has done a hugely important, wonderful job of just blowing the lid on how much more likely you are to struggle with addiction in later life if you've experienced any kind of childhood or even young adulthood sexual trauma. And that's what makes me hopeful. I think in my experience, there's a lot, from my experience and from what I'm receiving from readers, is that there are more issues where women don't feel like they can or really don't want to tell their partners, rather than once their partners or the men in their life know them, then not understanding or appreciating.
And the consequences of telling or witnessing what's happened to you can be an extra trauma, can't they? Because
And so trauma experience, there's a loneliness, there's an inherent loneliness to any trauma, because there's the feeling that one will never be understood. And Bri, I want to ask you, is there anything in having told your story of trauma that has, do you feel less, when the feelings of trauma come up, are they lessened at all? Is there any less loneliness in having shared the experience?
That's not quite how it feels for me. How it feels for me is that the thing that for a while made up such a huge percentage of my identity involuntarily is now a tiny blip of a fraction on my radar of how I choose to conceptualize who I am. And that I turned the worst thing that ever happened to me into something that I can be proud of and something that has made other people do things that feel good for them.
So an ultimate act of alchemy in a way.
Yeah, I feel like I still feel really sad sometimes. And certainly while touring the book, I have at times felt very alone and still been very upset and struggled through lots of like feelings of all kinds. But there's just this fundamental difference where before I used to feel that deep sadness and it would be accompanied by a sense of hopelessness. Now I still feel sadness sometimes, but I have hope.
I've got a question. We'll come to the front in a sec, but there's another question. We're at the back at the moment.
Hi there. So my question's more to do with in terms of systemic issues. So we all accept that we live within a patriarchal world. That's not necessarily a definition between man and woman. It's just that we live in a socio-behavioural world that is patriarchal. And a product of that is that unconscious bias occurs, how you speak, how you're perceived. I've had a couple of experiences recently that are just a product of unconscious bias. I'm going to bring a left kind of field thing. Dave Chappelle says that the issue is the system rather than in terms of individual opinions, or that maybe one of the things that we, collectively as humanity need to do is recognise that the inherent flaw is within the system. Something that I see on TV all the time is, for example, and TV here is gender-based biased adverts, which do drive me insane. Because, it's the football and dad's watching the football and mum's doing the cleaning, and it just happens again and again and again.
And who knew women needed that much yogurt?
Exactly, right? Exactly. Who knew?
Chicks, you just x-raying, they're like 80% yogurt.
Just interactive wear as well, just so it's I don't know. Is that somewhere we can start? Which is to say that I know Ofcom, where I'm from, started to ban gender-based advertisement, or at least to call it out, in terms of collective, both men and women, saying, well, just to stop the unconscious bias originally.
Well, I think that the problem is really, yes, unconscious bias exists, but the real problem is when we have internalised that voice of society in whatever way we needed to in order to survive in a society, and then we are not able to question that. So it's the internal, I can encounter bias on every street corner everywhere I go. Okay, so I accept that. The only point of power I have is if I don't feel powerful enough to stand up to it and to question it. I'm talking about the voice in our head that tells us that it's okay. So again, back to that, how do we change it? We teach ourselves to critically think, and we get all the examples we can of people who've spoken up and out, and we use that to fuel our own questioning of it. So nothing changes unless when we see that ad, we write the friggin' letter. And if we see that ad and we're sitting with our kids, we explain to them that's bullshit. Do you see what I'm saying? So for me, in my own life, the real problem was for all of those years where I did not feel that it was all right for me to speak up about that, because I had swallowed hook, line and sinker the story. As much as I thought I was, I didn't understand intersectionality. I didn't understand the relationship between trauma and submissiveness. So if we can educate ourselves, which we're all doing, obviously we wouldn't be sitting in this room if we weren't, and continue to have conversations, including the conversation with ourselves about what's worthy of saying out loud and do we have the right to question things, then we make progress.
I think Claire's right on the money there. I'm a lot older than the other panellists here, and certainly for the first 2 or 3 decades, I simply accepted that that's just the way the world was, and I could negotiate my way within it, but the idea of actually changing it never occurred to me. So I'm very optimistic that because we're so much more aware now, we see sexism everywhere and we can call it out everywhere. And I think that has made a huge difference. I think in the academic sector, in the last 10 years, although the practicalities haven't changed as much as we would like. I think the attitude has really changed a great deal. And I'd like to see that continue, obviously.
And can I just chip in here as well in terms of visibility of structural sexism? I'll give you an example from the world that I've worked in for the last 15 years in the world of sport. So since the AFLW came along 2 seasons ago, and women's football, Australian rules football, was taken to a new level, it never occurred to me until young girls started turning up at football clubs wanting to play, it never occurred to me that the infrastructure that supported Australian rules football, for example, was fundamentally and profoundly gender biased, because every football field that was built, every club rooms that was built, every cent of your taxpayer and municipal dollars that was spent on to maintain, to build and to accommodate men playing football was completely gender biased. And I'd like to think that I'm fairly, in tune with stuff. I was shocked that it hadn't occurred to me. So if someone like myself isn't making those sorts of connections, it's, there's a lot of work for men to do to be able to join the dots on these things, particularly men, who are, wanting to be part of change, to join those dots and to recognise that and do something about it, which is hopefully something that, we can do in a short space of time.
Yeah, visibility is really powerful. Just casting light on these issues of bias and discrimination just helps to rob them of their power. It's like when you give a label to something, all of a sudden it becomes salient. So this concept of mansplaining, that's a very new word, right? It's only been around maybe a few years. And we all hopefully a lot of us understood the concept before there was a word for it. We all knew what it felt like to be mansplained to. But it's so hard to articulate in the moment. You're sort of trying to say, well, what's this person doing to me? They're patronising me and they're explaining to me, something I already know. But now we have a word, you can just say, you're mansplaining, and that's it. It cuts it off at the knees.
Did I just mansplain?
No, that's not why I was That's not why I was thinking of it.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
Okay, can I just say that one of the things you just did something very, very important, which I think as feminists is like all of these biases that we have about how women are and how men are. We don't get equality until men are allowed to explain what they didn't understand and what they're now understanding, and until we allow a full range of emotions, not just to one gender, to all genders. And I think that's part of the important work that we're doing in the world, so don't just write the letters about the cliches about the blokes as well. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hi, thanks for the panel, it's been great. I'm a journalist. I want to know what you guys do around trolling in general. Are you aware of anything going on to police internet trolling? It's a huge thing, stifling debate, not just of women, but of women.
I block, delete. I spent years getting worried and checking my back. I block, delete. And I also, now I screenshot, file, block, delete. And I compare notes with my friends. I'll tell you a really interesting thing is at the ABC once there was just a series of texts that kept coming in and they were quite directive and they were quite... Anyway, my boss got onto, there's obviously a phone number and rang the number. There were 5 numbers, rang all 5, all went to the same centralised answering machine, which was, basically a bot. So that helped me go, all right, it's like, I'm not as scared because I have now a system, which is I take a photograph, I get rid of it, and if it's really worrying me, I ask someone to investigate it. I've had friends who have brought plenty of stuff to the police, and I can tell you I've never heard of a prosecution.
That's what I think. I think sometimes I read this stuff, I think, I should print this out, not for myself, but, and take it onto the police station. What are they doing? Drug testing down on Flemington Road. There's a huge universe they should be exploring, and they should be prosecuting.
It's completely bizarre that it's not being prosecuted, but that's because I think of the difficulty of prosecution in that arena. And
use of carriage service to menace or harass is a really big problem. Is that the local, the constable at the local cop shop, has never had to do that before.
But the law is on the books.
Yeah, there is a law. There are laws against it. It's also a little bit different because, I don't want to misstep here, but I'm quite sure that a lot of the laws that could be applicable are federal, not state laws, which mean also that you have like this sort of extra level this extra barrier to overcome in trying to even find the right person to report that kind of crime to, let alone find someone who will give you the time of day.
Can I just ask, as a journalist, if you're working for a particular organisation, have you had contact with them and told them about your experience, and what's been the response? Because you need that institutional support.
Yeah, my work's A1, fantastic. I don't really find it in emails so much to myself, but working in quite a male-dominated industry, it's something that I've come across in my working life. I think, it would be great to hear if any of you think, we should get onto our politicians to get onto the police to create some kind of a task force on it, because it's outrageous that people's voices are getting muted in this way.
Yeah, it brings out the worst in some people. There's no doubt about that. Oh, we've got time for one more question. I think because we're past our...
Hi, I just wanted to know, what message do you think it sends to women around the world, the fact that America has elected a president who sexually assaults women?
And about to put on the Supreme Court for a lifetime appointment, another man who's...
There's only one decent thing that's come out of it, which is that we're a bit louder. I mean, it's just like a fucking movie, really. It's
really bad.
There's a level of insanity to it. The only thing that that it makes me do is be less quiet and have more fuel. I mean, that's it. What message does it send? It's a really fucking dumb one.
Yeah, I think it's reflective of people's attitudes that they can tolerate someone like that in that kind of position of power. And I mean, you certainly see it, just in talking to people. People are dismissive, about this kind of thing. We just have this attitude of tolerance towards, disrespect of women. So sadly, I think it does reflect, maybe not the majority, I don't know. It reflects enough people's attitudes, for it to be sort of, indicative of like widespread misogyny. Sadly.
I must say I'm more scared of the people who elected him than I am of the buffoon that they elected.
Yeah. Look, I've spent a lot of time in America in the last 10 years, on and off, and I think that it's a complex problem. And I do believe it comes back a lot to economics too. America has, in some sense, given up on its social contract and therefore has lost complete faith in its institutions. And this is a cry of despair and to put it bluntly, a fuck you to the people that have governed that country for the last... Since the post-World War II prosperity that promised every successive generation a better life than the one that went before. And if you travel through Middle America, or if you travel through the southern part of America and you see the endemic poverty and the decaying infrastructure and the lack of hope and the lack of opportunity and the 1% of the population that controls the vast amount of wealth, then they no longer believe in the sorts of values that used to underpin their prosperity. And that's
it's almost as though values are a luxury.
Values are a lie. They don't. It is everyone for themselves because that's the way the country's being governed. And so the Trump experience in many ways reflects, an angry cry from a community that feels like it doesn't have anything left to lose.
I think also the other factor though is an angry cry against powerful women like Hillary Clinton, and I think Australia can't really. We're not very far ahead in that.
No, we were first.
That's right. We were.
Oh, we've got to stop, don't we? Because we've got to get kicked out in a second, aren't we? Thank you for coming. Can you please thank our panellists? And I've got to tell you, this has been a great edition of the Bold Thinking series, and there's plenty more to come. In fact, they're coming thick and fast. The Trobe upcoming events, the Postgraduate Expo on Tuesday the 9th of October, Todd Sampson, Jan Owen and Sophie Katcher and more at the Union Hall at La Trobe University. Thursday the 11th of October, the Unfinished Feminist Revolution, and Me Too Forgotten Women, Jane Caro and Anne Main having a conversation, and that one's happening at the Isabella Fraser Room at the State Library of Victoria. And then Thursday the 25th of October, we are back here basically picking up the threads of that conversation we just started there. Is democracy broken? That should be a great conversation to be had here. And if you know where to get your tickets from because you're here tonight for the next bunch of upcoming events for La Trobe University's Bold Thinking series. Also, if you want to share this conversation, it will be up as a podcast. Go to the Bold Thinking series website and you will be able to access it via SoundCloud as well. And also all our previous they're turning the lights up. We really do have to get everything. I know. All the previous conversations are there as well for you to check out as well. And share with your friends. Let them know if you think people are going to be interested in what was said here tonight. One last thing. Under someone's seat, there is a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory style golden ticket. Have a look. And you have won a copy of Bri's book, Eggshell Skull. She might even sign it for you. Thank you again for being here. Tea and coffee being served out the front, and we'll see you next time.